A very warm welcome to this seminar. We're going to discuss how the dynamic gospel can reach Europe's secular young adults. My name is Julia Garschagen. I'm from Germany and I'm the leader of the Pontus Institute for Science, Culture and Faith. I have the privilege of speaking at a lot of universities in the German-speaking world and beyond that in Europe. I also lead the biggest evangelistic youth outreach in Germany. So it's my privilege to talk to many young people or Gen Z or however you want to call them. And there's one observation that I constantly make and that I would love to discuss with you in the next few minutes. And that is that for many young people, the good news of Jesus Christ has actually become bad news. And I observe that on three different levels, at least. Firstly, on an emotional level. I was talking to an 18-year-old just recently, and he said, well, I don't need God. I've got my friends, I've got a good job, family, hobbies. I'm happy without God. It wasn't so much that he didn't have any problems or no question whatsoever, but it would have never occurred to him to search the answers to his questions in Christianity, or let alone enter a church. You see, for many young people, the question of the meaning of life is actually answered is finding your personal happiness. And on that way to happiness, religion is at best irrelevant, but for many it's actually harmful because it restricts my self-development and it limits me. Secondly, the good news has become bad news on an intellectual level. I was talking to a physics student the other day. We had a 3-hour conversation. He was very critical. And towards the end of our conversation, I mentioned that I actually believed in bodily resurrection. He looked at me, big eyes, and said, wow, until about a minute ago, I actually thought you were reasonable and intelligent. Well, I was happy to have kept up that image for 3 hours. Why believe in God who's just an illusion? For many young people, the belief in God is naive, it's fake, and for most of them, it's a given that science has already buried God. If you want to believe, okay, that's okay for you, you can do it in private if you need it, but there's no actual reality behind all that. So for a thinking student in the 21st century, again, faith is at best irrelevant, but to many, it's actually harmful because it blocks science and the development of our technology. And then thirdly, for many young people, the good news has become bad news on a moral level. I was at a university campus recently, and the non-Christian student group, the humanistic group, distributed leaflets against the Christian. They were warning against the Christian at the campus who, quote, try to implement restrictive moral ideas. They are an assault against the freedom we have fought for over the last decades. So you see, it used to be the case that people would say, you know, there are these Christians who have this high morality and we can't keep that moral anyway, so let's not even try. But today, I think the reserve has happened. Christians are seen as people with a bad moral. They are hypocritical, they abuse children and power and wealth, they're arrogant, judgmental, homophobic, against the freedom of women, and you can go on and on and on. And that was in the past, but it's also, for many people, true in the present. So young people today think, well, the individual and the society would both be better off if we abolished Christianity. So for many people, young people, Christianity is emotionally irrelevant, it's intellectually naive, and it's morally harmful. So far from being good news, the gospel has actually become bad news. So the question for us is, how then can we talk about the gospel in a way that it does sound like good news for this generation? And I think we do that by telling the better story. We need to tell the better story of the gospel for the individual and for the society. We need to show that the good news is emotionally satisfying, that there's power behind the gospel. We need to show that it is intellectually compelling, that there's truth behind the gospel. And we need to show that it is morally good for the individual and for the society. So let's start with the emotional good news, the power of the gospel. Oh, oops. You know, this generation doesn't first and foremost ask the question, what is true? It asks the question, what is helpful? They're very pragmatic, and they want to know about the relevance for everyday life. So I think we need to start by showing the power of the gospel, how it changes, how it transforms your life, how it makes a difference in everyday life, how it changes people's situations and lives. What difference does the gospel make in a Monday math lesson, or on Tuesday when I go to university, on Wednesday when I'm in the football club? And very often we, as people who proclaim the gospel, fall into the trap of the happiness gospel, as I call it. And we sort of say something along the lines of, well, if you only believe in Jesus, then you will be happy. Thereby, we actually baptize society, who says, yes, yes, happiness is your one and only goal in life. It is the meaning of life to be happy. And then, well, you've got to find a good way. And the Christians say, well, yes, that's the goal, but here we show you another way. Jesus is the ultimate goal, way to the ultimate goal of happiness. But that's actually heresy. The gospel cuts much deeper. It turns everything upside down. Jesus says, well, you see, happiness is not the goal in life. That would be so much pressure on the individual. I am the goal, he says, and I'm not a means to an end. I am the end itself. And yes, happiness does come along the way, but it's a happiness that doesn't depend on circumstances. It's a deeper satisfaction, a joy despite circumstances. Jesus speaks life into all of our lives, the ups and downs and the everyday life. So I think we need to find new ways about speaking about the power of the gospel and showing the relevance for the personal life, so that people wish it to be true because it's so attractive. As one young person said to me once, I don't know whether this is true, the whole gospel story, but if it were true, that would be the most beautiful story I've ever heard. Because you see, yes, many people don't ask the first question, is it true? But students actually don't want to be brought up by an illusion either. They don't want to leave their brain at the entrance of the church in order to believe what is said in there. And I feel with them. I come from a non-Christian family, and I was taught the value of critical thinking. So if church had given me the impression that I'm not allowed to think here and to ask critical questions, that wouldn't have been for me. I think we need to show how the Christian worldview is the intellectual, most convincing worldview. There are treasures of wisdom and knowledge hidden in Christ. And if Jesus is the truth, then he does stand up to any testing and to any question. Yes, faith has got good reason. A Swiss study about why young people leave their churches showed that the most highly ranked question that people had, why they would leave the church, was that there was no room for questions, no room for doubt, and that there was a lack of connection between science and faith. That's why most Swiss people left their church. I think there is a need for new apologetics, for a dialogue between the thinker of the society, the topics of our world, and the Christian gospel. And for that, we need to hold the newspaper or the tablet or wherever you get your newsfeed from, and the Bible, both in hand, and read the one through the lenses of the other. We need to pray hard, to listen well, and it's also a challenge. It's the challenge of keep learning, lifelong learning, critical thinking, of becoming engaged with society and the questions it asks. But I think it is worth the effort, because if the gospel is true, then it stands up to any questioning. So yes, let's show the truth of the gospel, but also let's show the beauty of the gospel. I had a conversation with a young woman recently, and she said to me, my biggest shame in life is that at the age of 25, she was 25, I have never had sex. She thought this was completely unnormal, but she also realized how strange it was for society that all their identity was based on sexuality. So I started talking to her and I said to her, well, you see, I don't think that society has got a too high of a view of sex. I think it's got too low a view of sexuality. I don't think we value sex enough in our society, because I think it's much more precious, because it's actually holy. It reflects the life-bringing and self-giving love of the Creator. She looked at me and said, that is the most beautiful thing I have ever heard. And I sat there thinking, that's true. That's how I want to talk about Jesus, so that people would see, oh, this is so beautiful. The gospel is good news for our society. It's got amazing treasures for the topics that the Gen Z is so interested in. You see, it's the Judeo-Christian worldview that holds to the fact that all people are made in the image of God and therefore they are equal. And that remains the best justification we have for human rights. Yes, Black Lives Matter because they matter to God. Or if you look at the uniqueness of the Christian hope, we don't hope for a disembodied heaven or some sort of nirvana. We believe that the God of this universe will renew the earth, will make it new and complete. And therefore, it's worth getting involved in the struggle and the fight against climate change, against racism, because we're being part of God's story. For me, that is the biggest motivation for my involvement in the causes for justice and the climate, because I know, yes, it's going to come to a good end, and God will take our little seed deeds and grow them into a big tree of his kingdom. I think it's very important that we learn to differentiate and to value the good that we see in this generation, that we look behind what they're saying, to the motives of why they're saying what they're saying. I often say to people who say to me, well, you know, I think all truths are just the same, relativistic worldview. I say, well, that's interesting. Why is that so important to me? And they often say, well, because I want harmony and I want peace in society. And I say, well, that's what I want too. We sit in the same boat, and I very much value your longing for it and your engagement for it. But let's discuss, if that is our aim, peace and harmony for the society, what is our best way to get there? How can we actually achieve tolerance and peace? And then I'm free to speak about Jesus, who I think was the most inclusive person this world has ever seen. He doesn't only say to be tolerant, he tells us to love our enemies and to forgive those who harm us, and he did so himself. You see, in order to get to a more tolerant society, we don't need less of Jesus, as is often suggested. We need to take Jesus more serious. The good news is the best news for the Gen Z and for all of us. So I encourage you to live out and to talk about the power, the truth, and the beauty of the gospel. Thank you very much.
Lonely, I'm Mr. Lonely, I have nobody to call my own. You probably know these very famous lyrics from a very famous song sung by Bobby Vinton in 1962 and also sampled in 2005 for Akon. A song about a young man who sings that he feels lonely. A young man who feels like a soldier estranged from his land, who has no home, who's searching for a home, and someone who feels that his life has been wasted, has been failing, and someone who's lost meaning. Well, that could be the anthem of our age, the anthem of the younger generations in particular. In 2021, a study for the European Commission revealed that loneliness is an epidemic which has taken place and grown within the COVID-19 pandemic. 20% of the European population are claiming that they feel lonely most of the time. Do you realize that's 1 out of 4 Europeans, which means that you definitely know several people who are in that category. But it gets worse, because the younger you are, the worse it gets. Between the ages of 18 and 25, the numbers of people who claim to feel lonely most of the time has been multiplied by 4 compared to 2016. whereas in the general population it's been multiplied by 2. That is the state of loneliness, which is described as a state of soul, a state of mind. And I believe that loneliness is one of the lenses through which we can better see or better understand the growing and gigantic crisis of meaning that Europe, or the West also more generally, is grappling with. And as I said, young people are more affected even than their older generations. And the question is why? I believe the answer to that why is particularly worrying for us as Christians, as leaders, and as observers of cultural trends. My name is Christel Lamère Ngnambi. I'm a communications consultant, and like Julia and Luke, my work sits at the interface with the secular youth. And I'm very thankful that in the context of this Lausanne Europe conference, we get to look at the situation of these younger generations. So let's take a look at the younger generations who are sitting at the forefront of this crisis of meaning. The meaning crisis has been described in the past years by a number of philosophers, social psychologists, and anthropologists. And a most recent description of that phenomenon explains that the meaning crisis that we are going through is, and I quote, a crisis of worldview that has no precedent in modern Western civilization. And the authors, in this case, who are not Christians, would not claim that they're Christians, explain that the meaning crisis, this crisis of worldview, has 2 aspects to it. The first aspect is an uncontrolled tendency towards self-deception and self-destruction. They also use the word foolishness, a tendency towards foolishness. This first aspect is a crisis of truth and virtue. We become, as a generation, as a civilization, more and more vulnerable to the natural tendencies towards self-deception, deceiving ourselves, understanding things that are wrong, believing things that are untrue, and also to develop behaviors that are self-destructive. We can call this foolishness also in the Christian sense, because in the view of these authors, this is a problem, a perennial problem, which humans have always had. And there are many examples of it. The loneliness epidemic that I described is one symptom of that meaning crisis. Another example is the tendency of swaths of population, especially the younger population, to retreat into virtual worlds and lose contact progressively with the real world, which seems too heavy to bear. Another example of that trend towards self-deception and self-destruction is a growing trend to suicide. Suicide even in the younger populations, and suicide even in cohorts of populations who had no prior psychological condition. And here's another example of that trend towards foolishness. It is what experts call diseases of belief. Look at the growing propensity towards spreading fake news and believing in them, towards believing in conspiracy theories, and more broadly towards being mobilized by new radical belief systems surrounding things like gender or race or history or health or science. These are all signs of a growing trend toward foolishness. And the Bible is also a testament to the fact that foolishness or folly has always been a fundamental, if not the fundamental problem in the human heart. Many of you, I'm sure, will know that quote from the book of Proverbs, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge," or the beginning of wisdom. Well, that verse also says, the following words say that fools despise wisdom and instruction. The psalmist also says, another famous quote from the Bible, "The fool says in its heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They do abominable deeds. There is none who does good." The American Christian philosopher Cornelius Plantinga explains it that way. He says, sin is folly. No matter what images they choose, the Bible writers say this again and again. Above all, at its core, sin is offense against God. Why is it not only wrong, but also foolish to offend God? Well, God is our final good, our maker and savior, the one in whom alone our restless hearts come to rest, and it is therefore foolish to offend him. That tendency has always been there in the human heart. However, the situation we're facing nowadays, at a wider cultural level is that this tendency seems to have accelerated and become uncontrolled. You may ask why, and that would lead us to the second aspect of the meaning crisis. For historical reasons, there has been a breakdown of wisdom. Well, wisdom is no abstract phenomenon. Wisdom is supported by a worldview, and therefore the breakdown of wisdom is a worldview problem. Wisdom is based on a series of practices, of traditions, of communities that work against the natural propensity towards foolishness. You find that in all cultures, and you would have found that in the West. Now, of course, this wisdom tradition in the West was dominated by principles stemming from the Judeo-Christian worldview. But we lost that worldview, a worldview which helps us cultivate wisdom and give us a greater sense of connectedness, which makes us feel more alive and fully connected. We have today tremendous knowledge, information. For generations, we have lost this wisdom culture, the worldviews, the communities, the traditions, the institutions that helped us find integrity and reconciliation with ourselves, with the world around us, with the people around us, and with ultimate reality, God himself, and at the same time fight against this propensity towards foolishness. Now, everywhere in Europe nowadays, generations Y and Z are generations that have been most poorly socialized in the Christian context and communities, who have sort of lost touch with this wisdom tradition, the tradition of the West. It doesn't mean that it's not accessible, but it means that we are in a state of crisis. And it seems to me that this crisis is leading us to a real and serious civilizational crisis. Now, there's lots that could be said about that, and we don't have the time to cover all of it. However, I'd like to touch on some strategic implications and conclusions that can be drawn in terms of evangelistic and discipleship ministries to generations Y and Z. And by that I mean children, teenagers, and young adults under 35. Now, even in that more specific topic, there's not huge amounts that could be said in the, 7 minutes that I still have, and we will hear Luke Greenwood, who will take us further. For my part, I'd like to draw this to one central idea, and that idea is the idea of finding common ground. So here we are in 2021, 2022. It's a world dominated by scientific endeavors, readily accessible information, and technological advances, but a world filled with believers. Secularization has not brought about generalized atheism. It is important to repeat it. And that is valid also for the younger generations. In 2021, a big study has come out in France about the younger generations, and generations Y and Z. And that study has found that for the first time in 70 years of the same study being conducted more or less every 10 years, the younger generations are more believing than the older generations. By that we mean that the percentage of young people who would say, I believe in God, is higher than the general population. And it's the first time that has happened. So the number of people who would say I believe in God has grown, even though that God is not specified. Which leads us to the second point, which is that religious feeling has almost completely escaped the sphere of organized religion. We know it. But religion, spirituality, belief in the supernatural, that certainly has not disappeared from people's hearts. And in a world of extreme free choice, which is dominated by the values of the market, which somehow have replaced this wisdom culture we inherited from the past and from the Bible, in such a world, generations Y and Z, who have known online communities all of their lives, they are giving birth to diverse and varied countercultures, subcultures, all sorts of communities, which have all in common that they become places where they can look for a worldview that makes room, makes sense of truth, justice, beauty, virtue, well-being. In short, they're searching for wisdom in a place, in a community where they belong and which can provide a structure to their lives. LGBTI communities, hip-hop communities, intersectional justice activists, third-wave feminists, the Gaia pagan activists, the new gamer far-right, or the new Muslim religious left. These are all communities that are prospering nowadays online in these generations. But these are communities of people in search of truth, justice, beauty, virtue, well-being, in search of meaning and wisdom, but prone to foolishness. And people whose restless hearts can only come to rest in the one true, ultimate, real God. A God whose passionate love for us has broken all barriers to unite us with him in Jesus Christ by the way he gave himself up, the Messiah for his people, the teacher for his learners, the one who embodies justice for us who are unjust, the one who is wisdom incarnate for us who are foolish. In this context, it's important to realize that these communities, and more widely the secular youth culture, they represent different interests and passions which can all provide common ground for us to engage with them, with evangelism, with discipleship. So I'd like to draw conclusions concerning that common ground about 3 characteristics this ministry can have in order to respond to this crisis of meaning. First characteristic, diversified ministry sent to fragmented common grounds. The people we call the secular youth are not one single cohort. They are diverse geography, languages, ethnic or national backgrounds, opinion, wealth, connection to religion, you name it. And that demands for us to realize again that as disciples of Jesus, we are sent people, sent to demonstrate the person and power of Jesus. This speaks especially to those of us who are members of the generations Y and Z, who are involved in these communities, who understand better the reality of these younger communities. Because today, the villages of Judea, where Jesus is sending his disciples, are on social media platforms, Twitter communities, YouTube viewerships, video game chat rooms, but also the streets, the clubs, the shopping centers, the demonstrations, the cultural events, and all the places where young people gather by subculture. So our ministry must be diversified and sent to fragmented common ground. Second characteristic, our ministry must be a ministry of synergy, moving into common ground. Talking here about a ministry which is present in the shared generational experiences. Because despite this diversity, fragmentation, and even polarization, the secular youth still faces a number of common experiences which makes them one cohort. They go to school, they share a general pop culture, they raise deep questions about identity, meaning, calling, gender, sexuality, citizenship. They later in life, as they become students or young professionals, they go through a number of similar transitions: study, work, love life, where to live, whom to spend time with. They face important decisions about money, about their place in society, about what kind of political view they will espouse, and all of these things. And most of all of the secular youth is sitting together at the forefront of this meaning crisis, and they need help, they need support. So this calls for us to address the truth and justice and virtue and well-being that these people are looking for, and demonstrate the gospel of truth, power, and beauty. That's what Julia mentioned. Truth, power, and beauty that Jesus brings into these spaces of common ground, where the secular youth are facing the same questions. So how can we steer our youth ministries, our student ministries, our young professionals ministries, our cultural apologetics ministries towards constantly addressing the challenges of the meaning crisis and place these experiences, these common experiences, into common ground? Now that demands gaining confidence again in defending the Christian worldview. So how can we, as Christians, leaders, and observers of cultural trends, strategically make efforts to work in synergy? What can we learn from each other's activities, our insights, our stories, even our own crises, and how Jesus speaks to them? So synergic ministry, moving into the common grounds, the shared generational experiences. And then lastly, the third characteristic for me is ministry on common grounds. And I'm talking here about wholesome, hospitable, meaning-making ministry. Demonstrating the gospel of reconciliation demands cultivating hospitality. And that speaks to the various people in our Christian communities who've been gifted with a gift of hospitality and can extend physical touch, food, warmth, prayer, and invite the kingdom of God into real relationships of friendship and mentoring, because the young people, they crave for that. That also means nurturing developing spaces, both physical and virtual, where Christians get to create a different culture as an expression of the truth of Jesus, of the church of Jesus, where young people can ask questions, explore meaning, explore truth together, but also join in Christian meaning-making practices that we receive, practices which cultivate wisdom and allow God to work, inviting them in our practices of reflection, of meditation, of Bible study, of prayer in the Spirit, of allowing God to work miracles and healing. Where else are they going to get that if not in the Church of Christ himself? So, a challenge for you and I: where are the third places, online and offline, where we will cultivate this culture? If the secular youth is not going to come spontaneously to our churches, and let's not fool ourselves, they are not going to do that. Most of them are not going to do that. Who will create the places like the court of the Gentiles in the Jerusalem temple, the places which are hospitable spaces for them to still meet the church of Jesus, even if they're not in our church buildings? Thank you.
Hi guys, Luke Greenwood here. I'm the European Director of a mission called Steiger, and it's with great joy that I get to join with Julia and Christel in sharing this teaching seminar with you guys today. What an important theme for me, one of, if not the most important, the front line of missions to reach young people, young adults in our global cities around the world, in Europe, of course, in our context, but the reality is so similar all around the world. And I'd love to bring some concluding thoughts here of what do we do, having heard what we heard from Julia, that a message that is good news has too often been seen and heard as bad news by the culture around us. How can we truly understand more deeply, and Julia did an amazing job of helping us understand where we're at today, where people are at in terms of Christianity and God and the state of the situation, and yet the truth and power of the gospel to respond to that today. And what Christel brought to us with the importance of recognizing the common ground that we can find even with a secularized society around us, and how we can respond to the crisis of meaning that is so prevalent in our culture today. When I look around me, I see three key heartfelt needs in our generation. People are anxious today. They're anxious, they're uncertain, they don't know the future, they don't know who they are, they don't know the answers to the most important questions. I believe that in response to the anxiety we see in our culture and our society today, we need to bring again the truth of the gospel, that ground we stand on, that clear truth of who God is, that there is right and wrong, that there is that we can know absolutes, that we can find out who we are and why we're here. The second heartfelt need I see is lack of purpose, lack of meaning, as Christel shared with us. And I believe that we need to preach again and remember again the power of the gospel to show us meaning and purpose in our lives and to transform our hearts. That is the power of the gospel that can bring meaning again to a lost generation. And that third heartfelt need is loneliness. Too many people are lonely today, not knowing how to really relate, what love truly is and how to belong. Their lack of community, of real relationships is so evident. And so many people are saying they feel lonely today, and that among young people often leads to worse, to suicidal thoughts and more. I believe that the gospel responds to this in an amazing way, because the beauty of the gospel shows us who we are, that we are loved, that we are precious in God's eyes, and that we were made for community, and that the gospel shows that God is love. So the truth, the power, and the beauty of the gospel is the most incredible response to the lies and questions of the culture around us today. I believe two things strongly in my heart. One, that the gospel is powerful today to reach the hardest hearts. And 2, that this generation is spiritually hungry, even when it doesn't look like it on the surface. So we need to go to them again. I believe that for too long, our evangelism has been come to us. If we do church cool enough, if we make our meetings cool enough, people will come to us. But I believe we need to go again to people. We need to be on the streets, in the universities, in the workplace, in the parks, in the festivals, in the clubs. We need to proclaim the truth of the message from the rooftops again, to do good old street evangelism again. We need to share who Jesus is with a generation that has forgotten or who never knew. We need to go outside the church to reach people who are not walking into the church today. And that's something I've experienced and seen firsthand. Over here in Poland with our missionary teams, we go each year to a festival called Woodstock. It's 800,000 young people and young adults from Poland and around Europe who would not usually walk into a church. Now, I have a band, and I thought, why not go and play a concert in this festival to share Jesus? We had one problem. We weren't invited. And to play in a festival, you have to be invited. But we have some punk roots. So in prayer, we decided that we didn't need an invitation. So we asked our team to help. We carried our sound equipment into the festival, a generator, a PA. We set up in the middle of the crowd, and we started playing our concert. Now, in our concert, I start by saying, this isn't a concert. It's a protest. It's a protest against the lies that we've believed since the day that we were born, that we are here by accident, that we have no purpose, that we're all alone, that life is just to work hard, buy stuff, get old, and die. That love is just a passing feeling, that we are the things we buy, and that we have no real purpose or meaning. These things are a lie, and we're here to protest against those lies. Now, by this point, hundreds of people are gathering around, listening to the music, getting into the protest vibe. And so in between each song, we're talking about the things that matter to people, that common ground that Christel talked about. Not only those feelings of loneliness, of anxiety, and of lack of purpose, but also looking to those values that people hold dear today. Those good things like how can we find equality, justice, and love in a broken world? And I start asking those questions. Where do these values come from? And through that, I start to point to our origin, that we were made by a loving God, and that's why we care about love and equality and justice and saving the planet. I talk about how we discover the love of God through the man Jesus, who came to this earth and became like you and I, and died on the cross and yet defeated death, coming back to life. And as I shared this message, people started to respond. I invited them to make peace with God, and we ended up spending hours praying and talking to hundreds of people that day. Now, the cool thing was the next year we got a call from one of the main stages of this festival inviting us to play. I said to the organizer, why would you invite us? We're not a known band. He said, well, last year I was walking through the festival and I saw an illegal concert happening. And I walked by and I saw a fire in the crowd. And I want that fire at my stage. That's how a non-believer described what he saw, the reaction of people as the truth and the power of the gospel was proclaimed in that place. So we said, okay, so we went and we played on the stage, the main stage the following year. And we shared the same message about who Jesus is and how people can find hope today. Afterwards, I went to that manager of the stage and I said, was it okay that we shared our faith so publicly? He said, yes. I said, what do you believe? And he said, I don't know what I believe anymore. Would you pray for me? And he took my hands and put them on his head and said, would you please pray for me? So I prayed for the manager of the stage in Woodstock Festival, as we did with so many other hundreds who are spiritually hungry today and who need to hear the truth about Jesus again. So I'd love to end with this call to action by looking at the story of Jesus going to that Samaritan woman in John 4. Now, we know the story, you guys will remember, but Jesus goes to a rejected place and to a rejected woman, showing the character of God going after us. That's what God does today. He goes after this secular generation. And when Jesus goes to the woman, he asks her for water. Now this, as we know, looking at the context, was to provoke her. She goes, how can you, as a Jewish man, ask me, a Samaritan, for water? He provokes her. He makes her stop in her track and think again. And that's what we need to do for this generation today. We need to provoke them and make them think again. They think they know who God is, who Jesus is, and they've rejected the idea of religion or of church. We need to provoke them to think again. The way the woman reacts is the way all people might react today, with pride, with, who are you to come and bring me or offer me water? When Jesus says, if you knew me and who I was, you would ask me for water. She says, well, who are you? I have this well that Jacob gave us. What do you have? And that's often how people react today. I don't need your God. I don't need this. I'm not religious. I'm fine. I'm good. I don't need what you're offering. But Jesus breaks through that pride with the truth of the gospel. And so for a generation that thinks we have it all, that we don't need anything more, we need to tell them again that Jesus is this all-satisfying water that is beyond anything this world has to offer, because it satisfies our souls. And that is the truth of the gospel. It needs to be preached to a generation that is lost in its pride and in its own world. Then Jesus goes further, because he speaks straight to the woman's heart and tells her everything about her life and her past husbands and etc. And there we see the power of the gospel speaking supernaturally into somebody's life and showing them how God can transform and change all things. And so the woman says, says that she wants this water, she needs this water. Jesus sends her back into the town. And there we see the beauty of the gospel, who takes a shy woman who was hiding at a well at midday, now becomes the bold missionary, the revivalist, who reaches her whole town and brings all the people back to Jesus. And we see the power, the truth and the beauty of the gospel at work in that Samaritan town. Well, you remember the end of the story, the disciples come back with food. Jesus says, I don't need your food. This is my food to do the work of the Father. And then he says something powerful. John 4, verse 35, he questions them, he challenges them. He says, you have a saying that the harvest will be ready in 4 months. But I say, open your eyes and see, the harvest is ready and ripe. I believe that is the message for us today. As we look at the reality of a secular culture around us, as we see that there is common ground, that there are many opportunities, as we see that people need to hear about the truth, the power, and the beauty of the gospel again today, we need to realize that people are spiritually hungry and that the harvest is ready. And I wonder what sayings Jesus challenges in our own hearts. Do we have sayings like that? The harvest might be ready in 4 months. Do we say things like, preaching the gospel on the streets doesn't work anymore? Or people are closed today, they're not ready. Or that doesn't work in my country or in my continent. What are the sayings Jesus challenges in our hearts today? We need to be reminded that the gospel is powerful, that it is true, that it is the ground we stand on, and that it is beautiful, that it brings true community, love, and transformation to people's lives today. So I want to remember that. And the call to action is that we would stop waiting for people to come to us, but that we would go to them, that we would understand the way they think, the questions and the thoughts and the heartfelt needs they have, that we would find that common ground and connect with people, but that we would be bold to tell them the truth about who Jesus is and to show them that he is a water that nothing in this world compares to, that it is all satisfying, that it satisfies their souls. So my prayer is that you would take away from this something that would lead you to action in your city and in your continent, here in Europe. The secular generation, the young adults who are outside the church, need us to go to them and tell them the truth about Jesus again today. So Father, would you do that in our hearts? Would you remind us the truth, the power, and the beauty of the gospel? And would you embolden us to go out again? Would you fill us afresh with your Holy Spirit to go out again to people, to connect with them, to provoke them, to show them that they're lacking something that is the only thing that can truly satisfy them, that is you. And I pray that you would embolden the church in Europe to preach the gospel again, and that this generation would get to hear who you truly are, and we have the opportunity and the access to that beautiful gospel, that good news And I pray that in your name, Jesus. Amen.